Hello, everybody. People are still logging in, but we're going to make a start now because we've got a lot to talk about. Welcome to this webinar where we're going to discuss the Conservative Party in opposition, something that they're not used to doing, given that they've been in power for 14 years, but they've now been cast into what some people see as the outer darkness of opposition. And we've got three great contributors who are with us today to talk about just that. We're going to start by introducing them. So I'd like to introduce you first of all to Muroki, who is an alumna of Queen Mary University of London, but she's gone on to do bigger and better things. She was an advisor to the new leader of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch. She is now working for the Centre for Social Justice, and you may have read some of her columns in newspapers. We're also going to be talking to Nigel, who many of you will be familiar with as the founder of the Centre for Opposition Studies. Nigel Fletcher has also published any number of books. The best one, because it's published in a series that I'm involved in, is institutionalized dissent. I can't even get my. He's got it on the shelf. There you go, which is all about how parties handle opposition and how they should handle opposition. And he's also the author of The Not Quite Prime Ministers, and he's a frequent contributor to Matt Chorley's programmes, whether they're on Times Radio, as was, or now on Radio 5 Live. And we've also got with us Lee David Evans, who is the John Ramsden Fellow here at the Mile End Institute. And he is in the middle maybe, or towards the end, I don't know, of writing a book on leadership contests. So three really, really great panelists. I'm going to just let a few more people come in before we start the discussion. How it's going to work is I'm going to get each contributor to talk for just under 10 minutes, somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes. And then we're going to conduct a discussion between them with me chairing, at which point we'll also try and include any questions that you may have. So do use the Q&A function to pop in some questions, and I'll try and get to as many of them as I possibly can. Okay, so we're going to go in this order. We're going to have Lee first on the leadership contest, then we're going to have Mercy on Kemi Badenoch, and then we're going to have Nigel on the differences between opposition and government, which are of course myriad and are the biggest challenges in some ways facing Kemi Badenoch and the Conservative Party. So Lee, if I can ask you to take it away.
Great. Well, Tim, thank you so much. And what I thought I would do is begin by discussing a little bit about what happened in the most recent leadership contest and some of the points I think are particularly interesting about it. So this was the fifth Conservative leadership contest in less than a decade. So it was the outcome of an unprecedented level of churn at the top of the party in terms of who leads it. It was also a leadership contest to take on a role which is particularly challenging. It's to take on a role of leading just 121 MPs in this parliament against the Labour government with a massive majority, and to try and rebuild both in this parliament and then at the next general election. So 6 candidates put themselves forward for that pretty daunting task. You probably remember, but they were Priti Patel, Mel Stride, Tom Tugendhat, James Cleverly, Robert Jenrick, and then the eventual winner, Kemi Badenoch. So some of the things that I think are interesting about this leadership contest. The first is that it started with quite a reduced talent pool, in that many of the people who you would have expected to compete for a leadership contest at this stage weren't candidates in it. So that was mostly for 2 reasons. One of them was that the election result was so disappointing for the Conservatives that people who were likely to contest the leadership before the 4th of July no longer found themselves in Parliament to do so. So that's almost certainly true of Penny Mordaunt. It's probably also true of Grant Shapps as well. The other reason why this was a restricted field really of candidates is that the party had made its way through leaders such a rapid rate in the decade beforehand that some of the people who you might have thought would go on to challenge for the leadership in opposition, maybe a former Foreign Secretary like Liz Truss, or a former Chancellor like Rishi Sunak, had already been and gone kind of in the role. So it started with this, like I say, quite restricted pool of candidates. And with it, the party decided to go long in terms of the contest. So after the election result on the 4th of July, Rishi Sunak announced his intention, formally began later on that month. There were the usual rounds of whittling it down to the final 2 among the MPs, and then handing it over to the party members. And then the final leader was elected or declared on the 2nd of November. So this was quite a lengthy process of choosing a new leader, but not uniquely so. I mean, if you look at 2005, Michael Howard resigned or declared his intention to resign in the aftermath of the election in May, and the eventual leader wasn't declared until early December. And that was the last time that the party chose a leader in opposition. And it was also the first time in 2005 since 1990 that the party elected a leader who went on to win a general election. So arguably having quite a long process to choose a leader is not necessarily a disadvantage. Whether or not that's the case this time, of course, time will tell. One thing I think it's worth commenting upon is some of the claims that are made about ideology within the party in terms of the candidates, MPs and members. I think it's a pretty perilous topic on the whole to consider. So for example, in this contest, we had a former Liz Truss backer who had voted Leave, who was widely seen as being the centrist Cameroon candidate. That was James Cleverly. And then we had a former Rishi Sunak backer who had voted Remain, who was seen as a figure of the right. That was Robert Jenrick. And that sort of speaks to how the way in which we think sometimes about ideology and candidates within the party, and also the way in which they pitch themselves, can be pretty inconsistent and over time. And I think that's because the truth is that the candidates were much more homogenous ideologically than most people were willing to admit. And nobody really stood in this contest with a plan to take the Conservatives and conservatism in a radically different direction to any of the other candidates. So we're all saying roughly similar things, if even in a different tone, about issues like immigration and the size of the state and taxation. But with those caveats in mind about how difficult it is to think about ideology and leadership elections, there was a generally consistent pattern of where support was coming from in this leadership election. So typically there were 3 candidates that were being supported by MPs and people on the right of the party. They were Patel, Badenoch and Jenrick. And there were 3 candidates who were broadly supported by people who would consider themselves more in the centre of the party. So that's Stride, Cleverly and Tugendhat. As I say, these aren't exact divisions, but this is broad brushstrokes about how people pitch themselves or where their support came from. And in the first 3 rounds of the leadership contest, we typically saw those 2 groups of candidates attract roughly the same number of votes. So in round 1, those that were broadly backed by people more on the right of the party got 64 votes, and in round 2, 61, and then in round 3, 61. So it's quite a consistent pattern there. Similarly, for those candidates who were more supported by MPs in the centre of the party, in round 1, they got 54 votes, in round 2, 58 votes, and in round 3, 59 votes. So there was this quite consistent pattern that suddenly snapped in round 4. And in round 4, we suddenly saw Badenoch and Jenrick attract 83 votes among MPs, and James Cleverly attract just 37. Now, this was in many ways the single most dramatic moment of the entire leadership election campaign. It was certainly the moment that nobody, myself included, saw coming. It seemed like a safe bet after those first 3 rounds that James Cleverly would certainly be in the final 2, and also it looked likely that he would probably top the poll of MPs. Why he didn't and how he didn't is one of those questions that will long linger about this leadership contest. It's also probably one to which we'll never really know the answer, in that the hypothesis that's most widely discussed is that Cleverly supporters, freelancing not as part of some collective effort, decided to try and make sure that he was up against the person that they thought he would have the best chance of beating. And some of them, it seems, independently thought that was Badenoch, and some of them independently thought that was Jenrick, and together they knocked their own candidate out of the contest. And if that is the case, the reason we'll never quite know for sure is it would be a pretty brave person who would admit to being one of those people who conspired to kick their own candidate out of the race. But maybe we'll all one day find out in a very honest and frank memoir. But the consequence of Cleverly's exit in the final MP's ballot was that this was the first members runoff, the first time in the final stage of a leadership contest under these rules, that both candidates were seen as coming broadly from the right of the party. So historically, there's tended to be somebody who's slightly more centrist as a candidate and somebody who's slightly more on the right. So in 2001, it was Ken Clarke versus Ian Duncan Smith. 2005, David Cameron versus David Davis. 2022, Rishi Sunak versus Liz Truss, etc. But this time we had two candidates who got most of their original support anyway, broadly from the right of the party. And this had some strange effects in my view, one of them being that there were some people who I'm pretty sure in a Badenoch and Cleverly contest would have been all behind Badenoch, who instead became critics of hers as being a rather centrist sellout figure. I think that was pretty much all gibberish and pretty much all always unwise as well, because of course she did in the end win the contest. So just wanted to wrap up by thinking a little bit about Badenoch's victory in this leadership election. So she managed to win quite decisively in the members runoff. So she had 56.5% of the vote compared to Robert Jenrick's 43.5% of the vote. But that was still the closest members vote that there's ever been in a Conservative leadership election. They do not tend to be particularly close. This one wasn't either, but like I say, it was the closest of them. I think Badenoch really got a mandate, not for a steady as she goes leadership, which nobody expects of her, but for a leadership which takes its time to get things right. During the leadership campaign, she didn't really commit to policies, with a few exceptions on school fees and VAT, for example. And she hasn't said that her election as leader is a mandate for her own views or exclusively for her own agenda, but that the policies will take time and it would be more of a collective effort. I think this is a wise approach for a new leader of the opposition to start out with, and it will probably avoid splits in her early leadership. But of course, ultimately, you do have to nail your colours to the mast at some stage, and that is where things can become a little bit more tricky. The key hope, I think, that Conservatives will have for Kemi Badenoch as leader at its most basic level is just that she survives in the role. And if you look at the leaders who have been elected since 1998 under the current leadership rules that the party has, then excluding David Cameron, they've only averaged 2 years in the job. So Cameron is the great exception. He's there for more than a decade. Everybody else, they averaged just 2 years. So this has been a staggeringly unstable period in the leadership with that one exception. So if Badenoch is to help the Tories recover, she's to lead it into the next election, and certainly if she's to become Prime Minister, then she will need to beat the record of her recent predecessors. There's an early sign that she's got a good chance of doing so. I think one of the flaws under the old Conservative leadership rules about no confidence votes, which used to be triggered if just 15% of MPs called for one, that threshold has now been raised to a third of all MPs. So I think we're less likely to see the sort of confidence votes and division and speculation about them, which has been a feature of some recent years of the leadership. But whether or not that will be enough to survive the Parliament and get the party back into government, well, time will tell.
Okay, thank you so much, Lee, for that. And it's worth saying that according to More in Common polling, which I saw this morning, the Conservatives have actually gone into the lead over Labour already. So that, I think, arguably bodes well for Kemi Badenoch, although you'd have to remember that I think, if I recall correctly, you can correct me, any of you, that actually David Cameron had a 5 percentage point bounce after about a week of coming in. So she's not doing quite as well as David Cameron, but that's not nothing. So anyway, let's turn now to Mercy Muroki. So Mercy, tell us all about Kemi Badenoch and what you think her chances are.
Sure. It's great to be here. So as you said, Tim, I worked for Kemi for about 1.5 years in a policy capacity rather than a sort of a political special advisor capacity. This was during her time as Minister for Women and Equalities, at which time she was also the Secretary of State for Business and Trade. And in various guises before that, I have worked formally or informally for her on various sort of ad hoc bits to develop some of her policy thinking in the years before that. So I'd say I've had a good working relationship with Kemi, and I've been one of the people, I say, who have particularly on the issue of sort of ethnicity, race, and those sorts of issues, have sort of been supporting her in developing some of the thinking around what a conservative approach to those questions looks like. I was never surprised at all that she had the real potential to come this far, not least because if you looked at sort of conservative home polls over the last few months and years, she was an incredibly popular MP. She was an incredibly popular minister amongst party members. So it was not a surprise to me that when it eventually, which it inevitably would have done, come down to it, she would have been particularly popular amongst the party members who, of course, have the final say. I think Kemi's rise to where she is now is remarkable on a number of fronts. And, you know, the most obvious sort of visible one of which is that she's obviously the first Black leader, the first Black female leader of a major political party. And that's remarkable in and of itself. And although looking at sort of how while Conservatives do tend to do relative to Labour in terms of ethnicity and gender when it comes to leadership, it's probably not as remarkable as it would have been a few years ago. But I think Kemi is one of the most formidable characters in British politics. Certainly, she has been one of the most formidable and outspoken Conservative politicians, perhaps arguably any party. And I think she's remarkable in that is perhaps not a strategy many people trying to get to the top might use, to wear their heart on their sleeves, to take on this role as a sort of a controversial figure, which I think she sort of embraces. I don't think she goes out necessarily to be contrarian or to cause controversy, but I think she is a leader who does wear her heart on her sleeve, isn't afraid to sort of ruffle feathers if it's coming from views that she genuinely holds. I think she's somebody who isn't afraid to take the fight to her opponents, whether they be her opponents in Parliament. We've seen her sort of, you know, ruffle feathers in what might be described as her opponents in the media. And so she isn't afraid to take on that fight. Whether that's a particularly good strategy is a big question, because it has landed her in trouble several times, whether it's from saying things that are particularly slightly controversial, from misspeaking and being misinterpreted, as she would say, or just from allegations. You know, there have been allegations that have come out that she was a difficult to work with person. So because of the kind of style that she has, she does open herself up to these sorts of things, which if you look at somebody like Keir Starmer, who's very square, who almost kind of looks like he's always constantly thinking how he's coming across and wanting to be the sensible one, it is a very stark contrast between those two leaders. So I think it's going to make for a very interesting dynamic over the next few years, or however long both leaders are leader. I think the length of time, the rise of Kemi, the speed at which she's risen in the party is particularly remarkable as well. She was elected in 2017, and you know, now she's leading the party, one of the most successful parties in Western history. She's had a number of posts in that time, some of which have been key posts, such as being Business and Trade Secretary. And whilst we were sort of going through the transition of bringing EU legislation or not into our own legislative framework. And I'd say one of her big things that she is particularly noted for, and I think one of the things she cares about most from a policy perspective, has very much been the equalities brief. I think that's a brief that she feels very personally connected to, and it's a brief she has tried to be a figurehead for when it comes to conservative thinking and conservative narratives around women and equalities. And I think that's can credit, I guess, her rise to fame almost, because she has become somewhat of a celebrity, particularly online, amongst sort of the conservatives commentariat. I think she has her outspoken views about race and gender to attribute to that, because she has been the most outspoken politician on those issues. And when we were going through the sort of era of woke and anti-woke, which I actually think is kind of dying out now, but she was at the forefront, making what were quite controversial statements at the time about things like race, about things like the trans issue. And I think it's going to be particularly interesting because she's expressed her frustration around the civil service and around how slow it grinds, and around what she thinks is a big chunk of civil servants that frustrate the agenda of ministers. I think what's going to be particularly interesting, given how much she does care about those issues, is how she's going to use this platform as leader of the opposition, how she's going to use it to kind of champion those issues, and what she's going to say about those issues, and what she's going to seek to put forward as the policy of the official policy of the Conservatives on those issues. I'm sure we'll get into what her cabinet says about her later on in the conversation. But I think that the key takeaways for me is that I'm not surprised that she has become leader, and it's not particularly surprising that she's risen so fast. I think she is going to be a strong leader. Whether she's going to be as popular now amongst the party as she later as she is now is another question. There's lots of things that could go wrong, but I think we're going to see a leader who wears their heart on their sleeve, who is unashamed about putting forward sort of conservative ideological points, rather than just tinkering around with policy points. And regardless of how it goes, I think it's going to be a very exciting time to be a spectator and a commentator.
Okay, thank you very much, Mercy. That's great. Over to you, Nigel.
Thank you. And some really fascinating points from my fellow panelists there. And going last means that I can sort of bounce off some of their comments, which is always very good. So I thought, first of all, I think the one of the real challenges that a new leader of the opposition faces is the fact that quite obviously they're not in government, but that's the first thing they notice. But for the Conservative Party, as we're looking at this, particularly the Conservative experience of being in opposition, they tend to find it more difficult, I think, than Labour to be in opposition. You often see, and in many of the histories of the party, including those that you've written, Tim, the Conservative Party changes over the years what it means in terms of its policies and its beliefs and its platform, according to who is leading it and according to the spirit of the times. But one thing that it does retain is this appetite for power, as John Ramsden called it. And so if you sort of characterize the Conservative Party, it is a party of power. The Labour Party, on the other hand, from its origins, is very much a party of protest. And so they are different beasts as our two main parties now. And so the first thing that you really notice about the Conservative Party going into opposition is that it's quite uncomfortable. They instinctively don't feel like this is the sort of the correct order of events, you know, that they should be in opposition. And so they start looking ahead. And one of the things I was looking out to see during the leadership contest was how much of the process of grief they had gone through, because I really do think when a party loses an election, they do go through a grieving process, and part of that is denial and anger and all of those other things that you get during a sort of grieving process, and a lot of it is this denial. They sort of have this immediate attitude that, well, we're going to come straight back, this is a setback, but we're going to come straight back. And so they start talking about government. They start saying, I'm as your prime minister, I'm going to do the following. And it was interesting. I think only Tom Tugendhat explicitly used that as his platform during the leadership contest. He talked about, we're electing a leader who needs to be someone who can be prime minister, and he used that as a sort of a rhetorical device during a lot of his appearances. I was quite surprised and perhaps encouraged that a lot of the other candidates didn't do that. They did recognise what job it was that they were applying for, which is to be leader of the opposition. And it is a very different skill set that you need to be an effective leader of the opposition and to lead your party back into power from opposition than it is to take over in government. And that's another interesting point I thought that Lee made about the fact that the Conservatives have burnt through a lot of the candidates who would otherwise be expected to have been there in the mix to be leader of the opposition when they sort of crashed out of power. If Boris Johnson had served out his full term as prime minister, having won that majority in 2019, then the Conservatives would be going into opposition with Boris having lost an election. And as he said, I think that there would have been then quite a number of very serious candidates with some of those skills. I mean, you could look at Rishi Sunak and his, if nothing else, the buzz around him when he was Chancellor and then becoming a candidate to be leader of the Conservative Party. His social media game was good, and he had a lot of sort of communications expertise. Those are the kind of things that I think we would have seen in opposition. So I think that's a really important point, that they have burnt through a number of candidates. And interestingly, James Cleverly, the other senior figure in the cabinet, did not do very well. So one thing I think they have leapt forward to, which I think comes to sort of some of the points that Mercy was making about with Kemi Badenoch, is somebody who is quite a different type of politician. She's somebody who is not a sort of scripted and safe politician. Often, in government, the thing that civil servants and people want is that their minister to be a safe pair of hands on the media, which usually means they don't commit news. It means they can go on the airwaves and you can be pretty sure they're going to be pretty boring, stick to the line, and nothing dramatic is going to happen. Not making news is usually seen as quite a good thing if you're a minister doing a round. In opposition, trying to get noticed at all is a real difficulty. And one of the things that, as I say, Conservatives will find particularly difficult, but all oppositions find difficult, is how few people are paying any attention to them. Tim mentioned in his introduction, I've done a few spots on Matt Chorley's show over the years, and we were going to do quite a bit on the Conservative leadership election. And what actually turned out happening is that there wasn't a lot to say on the Conservative leadership election because it wasn't really in the news very much. And so, I think I spoke at the beginning of the contest and we get a bit of a catch up and at the end, I sort of, but there really was a sense that people weren't paying any attention to the leadership contest. And I think that's a real shock to people who have been in government and have been used to the media covering every sort of episode of the psychodrama of the Conservative Party as it ditched one leader and started to elect another and so on. That's interesting to the public and to the media because you're in government. When you're in opposition, they really, unless there's a particular reason, don't care very much. So that's a real difficulty. And so having a leader like Kemi Badenoch, who is able to attract attention of the media and say things that are seen as interesting, is a real bonus on the face of it. But again, as Mercy said, it does carry some risks to it. If you're saying interesting things, generally speaking, it's because they're controversial things, and so that does carry that risk with it. So it's going to be that trade-off. But for my own observation of it, I think that Kemi Badenoch is genuinely an interesting politician. She has some quite nuanced views on particular issues that she has set out over the years, which when you've been a minister in government for quite a lot of that period of time, as I say, it's quite difficult to actually be noticed for saying interesting things when you've been a sort of a mid-ranking cabinet minister and you're supposed to stick to the script. She has managed to carve out over that time a profile for herself on these issues of pushing back against certain elements of the sort of prevailing equalities agenda that she disagrees with as Minister for Equalities. She was noticed for that. And so, she has perhaps got more of a profile from that than we might have expected. But in opposition, she has to be, I think, a bit careful that there is a limit to how much people are prepared to give attention, and therefore you get defined by things much more quickly. And so, as William Hague found out with his baseball cap, and you still hear people as well, I don't know if anyone, this may be fading a bit now, but drinking 14 pints was the other story that he came out with in an interview with GQ magazine. It still gets cited now. People say, oh, William Hague is the guy who drank 14 pints. You know, this throwaway remark that he made in a magazine interview at one point during his sort of 4-year leadership of the Conservative Party still gets thrown back at him and remembered. And of course, you know, Ed Miliband with his bacon sandwich, all of these things, these little moments that happen when you're in opposition. You know, in government, there's constant sort of media opportunities. You're doing things all the time. People are noticing things. In opposition, you've got to be very careful that the very limited media opportunities that you tend to get when people are paying attention don't define you in a negative way. And it's all very well for me to sit here and give that advice from historical examples. But one thing, you can't predict what they're going to be. So it's quite difficult. You sort of say, you know, don't do something stupid. Well, that's fine, but you know, don't be unlucky. That's quite a difficult piece of advice to give to somebody. But I think that's really what they're facing. So we don't really know, I think, what it's going to be. That there will be something, I'm sure, over the next months or years that Kemi Badenoch will cause a huge media circus around something that she says or does, and none of us can really predict what that's going to be at this moment. And it may sort of rebound to her credit and sort of improve her position, or it might not. But I think it's one of the things you have to accept in opposition is that you're not always in control of events, and that is a really hard thing for people who, as politicians, want to be making the weather. And if you're a political advisor and an apparatchik and a strategist, you want to be controlling things and try to make sure that you've got as much control over the narrative and things as possible. It's difficult enough in government because stuff keeps happening to you. In opposition, it's even more difficult because you're trying to, one, get noticed, but get noticed in the right way. And that's difficult when you're trying to put forward policies. William Hague, again, I go back to William Hague quite a lot because he's the comparable leader, having come in sort of in the modern age after a large landslide defeat. Of course, Kemi Badenoch has a smaller parliamentary party, and she has a party to her right in the form of Reform UK, so she is arguably in a more difficult position than William Hague was in. But his experience is, I think, quite useful in the sense that you know, he struggled with this issue of being noticed. He once described giving a speech which they worked on for weeks, big policy announcements in it, and he turned up to give it, and in the following day's papers there was literally not a single sentence about the speech. And that's the moment he said he realised this is, you know, really very difficult in the midst of opposition when you look a long way from power. No one is paying any attention to you until they are, and that could be in the wrong way. So I think that's where I'll leave it for that. For my opening remarks, the first thing people will notice, they will notice lots of other things as they go through the experience of opposition. But the first thing they'll notice is it's really hard to get noticed.
Okay, Nigel, thank you so much. So we've had 3 great contributions there. I thought what we'd do is come in with a few questions now. And actually, I am going to include some of the questions that have been asked by the audience so far. One of which touches on ideology. We talked a little bit about that in terms of Kemi Badenoch's commitment to, you know, so-called culture wars or anti-woke politics. Although I'm interested that, Mercy, you see that as dying down a little bit. But Lee Jones, who I suspect is our colleague here at QM, has asked about the extent to which actually the Conservative Party and Kemi Badenoch are still very much attached to this kind of small state Thatcherite conservatism when it comes to the economy and when it comes to public services, and asks whether that can really do very much to pick up some of the particularly working class voters that the party has lost between 2019 and 2024. And that feeds into a question that Emily Hickey has asked as well, particularly to Mercy, but you know, others can answer it. And to what extent, and we've heard Nigel make parallels with William Hague, but to what extent are there parallels here with Margaret Thatcher? So perhaps I'll go to Mercy first of all with that, not just on the Thatcher question, but also on whether actually this, you know, Thatcherite conservatism still has really that much to say to people in the 21st century.
Yeah, well, I think so. Kemi has said Thatcher is one of her political heroes. It seems that's what every Conservative MP says. I don't think I think it'd be heresy to not say that if you're trying to be leader of the Conservatives. But I think that they're clearly both very strong-willed, very defiant characters, and perhaps you have to be when you're leading, a political party, and one that is far more male than its counterparts. I think one thing that was notable in Kemi's campaign, which I wasn't convinced about whether it would be a winning strategy, was this sort of complete focus on values and principles rather than policies. And so, in a way, when we think about Margaret Thatcher, of course, we associate her with conservative values. She was really very much sort of putting conservative values into practice when it came to her policy positions. And we can see that Kemi has very much said she's unashamedly sort of capitalist, unashamedly free market, pro-business. She talks a lot explicitly about personal responsibility and those sorts of things. Where we don't have a comparator, I suppose, is on what policies emanate from that. And that's what I found quite curious, in that, okay, you can say we value personal responsibility and that's what's going to guide our politics. Well, does that mean you want more people? What does that mean? Because if you're Margaret Thatcher, you might say you want more people to own their homes. You want more to give people, do as much as you can to make sure people own their homes, so they have a stake in society. You're going to help them get on the housing. It wasn't clear exactly what policies were coming from the principles she was advocating. So I think that's where we kind of have to wait over the next perhaps few weeks as she develops those policies to see whether they are what might be considered Thatcherite policies.
Okay, well, I'm going to throw the same question to Nigel and to Lee, but I want to bring in a question which in some senses is kind of related to that, because Phil Burton-Cartledge makes the point that actually she has committed to a couple of policies since becoming leader of the opposition. The first one is reversing the VAT that's going to be levied on private school fees, and the other one seems to be reversing the changes to inheritance tax on agricultural land. Are these going to be the kind of policies that win back some of those voters, or are they in some senses what we would expect, if you like, of a fairly kind of bog standard Thatcherite politician? So I'll throw it to you, Lee, first.
It's interesting that they are the two policies that have been announced so far, and it is true to say that they are policies which we would think of as appealing more to the traditional Conservative base than reaching out to the rest of the country. The third, perhaps obvious policy for a Conservative leader to commit to at this stage, bringing back the winter fuel payment, is arguably another example of that it would appeal to a demographic that the party has depended upon in recent elections. I think there will unavoidably be moments where certain issues sort of catch the public imagination, and as leader of the opposition, Badenoch will want to try and take a position on them, to try and sort of make the most of a time when they are salient. As Nigel said, otherwise it can be pretty difficult to really get your own message across unless you can latch them onto an issue. I think the question of the state and the size of the state is interesting, because it's most Conservatives believe in reducing the size of the state, or at least keeping the size of the state in check. But it's not really something that Conservatives have been able to do. And the reasons for that aren't because we've had Conservative governments who have decided that we should be spending lots more money on this and that. It's mostly just the demographic challenges facing a country like our own, particularly in healthcare and pensions. And that's not going to go anywhere quickly. They are challenges which are there. We've got a Conservative government or a Labour government, and it's the question of how do you make the British state work at a time of demographic change, which is going to add pressures onto the state. And how can you talk about that, and how can you make a credible argument about that as a Conservative? I think the the possible area for doing that is that if we think about the role of the state in two different ways, maybe what the state spends and what the state tells people what to do. I think it's much easier to say that the state should tell people to do, what to do far less than it currently does, and to take a slightly more libertarian approach to issues like smoking outdoors, etc., or an eventual smoking ban. I think that's where we may see some of the talk about reducing the role of the state in British life focus on, rather than what is the unavoidable and much trickier question of how do you basically reduce the state when people have got more demands of it.
Okay, and I'm going to chuck in a further question to you, Nigel, but if you can come back on some of what we've already talked about, which is this commitment to Margaret Thatcher. Rob Saunders has said, has the party's obsession with the Iron Lady, and often rather a mythologized version of her time in power, become a problem? So in other words, is avoiding what Mercy talked about as heresy, leaving the party rather stuck, if you like, ideologically, and in terms, obviously, of the policy implications therefrom?
Yes, I mean, it is something that has sort of hung over the Conservative Party since her time, and I think, as you say, this sort of mythologized version of Margaret Thatcher is the key here. I think those who have actually studied Thatcher in a great deal of depth, including Emily, who asked one of the questions on this, and others, there is a huge difference between the sort of the myth of Thatcher and Thatcher as she was in office, but also in opposition prior to that as well. So I think she was a figure who sort of evolved over that time. What I find striking about the Conservative Party today and in recent years is the extent to which we have sort of replaced a clear-sighted idea of ideology and policy with kind of a sort of vibes of politics. And it comes back to what Lee said at the beginning, the sort of this odd positioning of the candidates during the leadership contest, where you had a sort of, Cameroon Remainer, who in a sort of a fairly bland minister, frankly, Rob Jenner reinventing himself as this candidate of the right, and then you have James Cleverly sort of seen as this kind of centrist wet when he was a Boris Johnson backer and had voted Leave and so on. It is odd how there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason really to how a lot of them are perceived. But also, I think there has been, which is quite common with the Conservative Party, there's been a lack of sort of distinct coherence to their programme and to their ideology. What is the sort of uniting idea of particular leaders? Conservatives don't tend to think very much about sort of coherent ideology. It's not something that preoccupies them a lot. But since Margaret Thatcher, there's been this idea that you have to be a true believer. I think that's what Margaret Thatcher did to the Conservative Party. I think that she injected into their bloodstream something that was much more common in the Labour Party. That idea of, you have a sense of what kind of ideological politician you are. But since then, politicians have, as Mercy quite rightly says, it's a sort of mantra they have to go through to say, oh, of course, I'm a great admirer of Margaret Thatcher. The follow-up question for any selection committee that hears that from a candidate, as they always do, is to say, what do you admire about Margaret Thatcher, and which Margaret Thatcher do you admire? Is it the Margaret Thatcher of, the sort of conservative way forward, and the sort of those in the Margaret Thatcher Centre, and all those people who sort of have this particular idea of Margaret Thatcher as a kind of hardline Eurosceptic small state person, or is it sort of the Margaret Thatcher who was sort of wearing her European Economic Community jumper and campaigning for to stay in Europe in the 1970s, and being a much more pragmatic politician during her time as leader of the opposition and then as prime minister. So I think you have to sort of look at the history of it in a bit more sort of nuance. But I do think that one of the issues the Conservative Party has since Margaret Thatcher, as I say, is that there is this sense that you need to be a true believer. And what I always hear from people is, I don't want to back that person. They're not a true conservative. They're not a proper conservative. We need a proper conservative. That's what we need. and there's never really a coherent sense of what that means. They managed to go in a lot of these candidates, a lot of these activists, from sort of really quite sort of a full-throated support of Boris Johnson, who was, as he described himself, a Brexity Hezzer. He's not somebody who was a small state kind of Thatcherite politician, but someone who really appealed to Leavers and the sort of conservative base, who thought, he's a true conservative, we're going to back him. And when he was brought down, they really objected to that, and immediately overnight went to back Liz Truss, who, in terms of her economic policy and her agenda, so totally different end of the spectrum, as someone who is a genuinely sort of libertarian small state politician, very different to Boris Johnson in what she's actually offering as a platform. But there was a seamless transition from this kind of fan club around Boris Johnson to Liz Truss. They're proper conservatives. That's what we need. We need a proper conservative. So I think that's what Margaret Thatcher has done to the Conservative Party, is to sort of give this idea of you've got to be a strident and really kind of sort of declaratory conservative. But I think the Conservative Party has retained its pragmatism over what that actually means in practice. It's the kind of vibe, as I say. And actually what's interesting about that is that I think Kemi does have the ability, as someone who we've talked about, and as Mercy has said, as someone who is quite a sort of eye-catching and interesting politician, to capture that kind of vibe of being a strident Thatcherite politician, but within that to actually reinvent to some extent what that means for the modern age, which is quite a neat trick if you can do it. But it's something that historically the Conservative Party has done successfully over centuries.
Well, one of the main tasks, obviously, of an opposition leader, particularly when they first come in, is to choose their shadow cabinet, and that's something that Kemi Badenoch has now done. And I wondered if any of you had any views on what that says about the future direction of the party, and indeed the way that Kemi Badenoch is going to lead it. Mercy, will you take that one?
Yes, and actually, when Nigel there was talking about which version of Margaret Thatcher do Conservative MPs actually, want to shadow, I was thinking how, Margaret Thatcher was quite a passionate environmentalist. She was the first world leader to raise the threat of climate change at the UN in 1989, where she spoke quite passionately about how it was this massive threat sort of, facing us. And, I'm just thinking now how the Conservative Party have, since Rishi Sunak a couple of years ago started rowing back on their net zero commitments, they've kind of become more and more climate skeptic. So I don't particularly think that's a version of Margaret Thatcher they might necessarily they might not see themselves as trying to advocate at the moment. And on that point, one of the appointments Kemi has made is putting Claire Coutinho, who was Energy Secretary when they were in power and is now Shadow Energy Secretary still. And she's somebody who is she's not a climate skeptic by any means, but she has expressed skepticism around the net zero target, around this focus on target, how fast we're moving. And I think the issue of climate is going to be one of the huge battlegrounds, actually, given how far Labour how much further they want to go on climate than the Conservatives did. And so Kemi also has said that she's skeptical about this net zero target, although she's not skeptical about man-made climate change. So I think that's going to be an interesting point of contention between the two parties. What I would say, generally speaking, about her appointments is that they really don't, for me, they don't signal any particular ideological direction. I think it's quite a sort of a Frankenstein's monster almost of a shadow cabinet, in that it is a bit of a mishmash, I feel, of people. And I think given that she was very adamant, I think she's trying to do two things. She's trying to be very adamant about Conservatives have to return to Conservative values, and there is such a thing as being a Conservative and having Conservative views, and that's what I'm going to represent. But she also faces this other problem of saying she's going to renew and unite the party. And she would obviously say, of course, the party is a broad church. We welcome it being a broad church. And so I think those two things might cut, there might be some friction in those two things, because she might, in trying to appeal to so many wings of the Conservative Party, the message that we have to return to conservatism might become quite diluted in that. And so I think there's nothing in her appointments that necessarily gives a strong sense of direction of where she's going to take it. And I was disappointed actually to not see Tom Tugendhat get a shadow cabinet role. He's a minister for security minister, I think, but I was hoping he'd get one of sort of the big ones, perhaps defense or foreign secretary. So yeah, I think perhaps maybe she's thinking this is how she shapes and renews the party, by not putting in the typical faces that we're used to and not necessarily going for people that would have been obvious for her. But again, she's facing a very diminished talent pool, so that might also be a reflection of that.
Okay, Lee, should she be worried that Tom Tugendhat and obviously some of the other leadership contestants, James Cleverly, the obvious one, have not decided to serve in the shadow cabinet, or is that really kind of inevitable and something that no leader of the opposition can really do very much about?
I think a lot of people will say it's a shame that they haven't decided to serve in the shadow cabinet. And in James Cleverly's case, announced it even before the leadership election was over. I mean, if I draw from an example that Nigel spoke about earlier about William Hague, I think that was one of his big problems after 1997. You know, that Ken Clarke, who he had defeated, the most famous barring prime ministers and most liked Conservative in the country, said he wasn't going to serve in the shadow cabinet. But like Michael Heseltine did the same and went to the backbenchers. And it basically meant that Hague had a blank slate in terms of the team that he put together, but it wasn't really the heavyweight team that he would have wanted to take on Blair and Brown. So I think there would be a sense of regret that some of the other leadership candidates chose not to serve. But I think in terms of putting the shadow cabinet together, I think generally speaking, Kemi Badenoch's made a lot of sensible choices. I think two former candidates for the leadership, the role of shadowing two of the great officers of state, Mel Stride as Shadow Chancellor and Priti Patel as Shadow Foreign Secretary, shows that she's reaching out to the other candidates who want to work with her to make it succeed. And I think that's the sort of tone that she would have wanted to set from the beginning. In terms of looking to the future, I wanted to comment briefly on the Thatcherism point. I think there's a generally important thing that Conservatives have to recognise, which is that you can only really do the Thatcher revolution once. You know, that she came into office in 1979 with a huge amount of industry privatised, things like estate agents and travel agents still in government hands that she privatised, extraordinarily high rates of personal income tax that she reduced. But the Thatcher economic settlement has not really been undone. Now, the fact that the state is relatively, is larger today than most Conservatives say they want it to be, is not because the Thatcher economic model has been reversed. It's still the model that's with us today. And attempts to try and think you can redo the Thatcher revolution, which is partly where I think Liz Truss's leadership ran into problems. A, to think that you can redo it, and B, to think that you can do it in the space of a couple of weeks, which it took her 11 and a half years to do. I think is something the Conservative Party has to sort of disavow itself of as a key part of its driving mission. One thing I think is really interesting about Kemi Badenoch in terms of how she frames her agenda is she talks about sort of system failure in the British state. She talks about the issues created by things like devolution, by more powerful courts, by issues like judicial review of legislation, about culture in Whitehall, etc. And arguably, if you think that, as many Conservatives do, that Margaret Thatcher got the country into a good state by the time in which she left office, the bit of the British state and the bit of Britain which is most different, I think, to them in terms of the government or the economy is the way in which the government works and the way in which the state sort of operates. And I think Badenoch does have a critique of the post-97 Blair settlement on these things that she talks about in a way that Conservatives haven't done for quite a while. And like so much in politics, it can be easy to say but difficult to do. But I think that will be an area that she will continue to talk about. And also an area where it'd be more interesting to see what a Conservative vision for the future will look like, rather than just trying to hark back to some of the key talking points of the 1980s.
Okay, thank you very much. So Nigel, on the shadow cabinet, does it say anything to you? Obviously one of the most difficult things that a leader has to do, try and balance all the demands from the various regional parts of the Conservative Party, the ideological parts of the Conservative Party, the careerist parts of the Conservative Party. How's she done, do you think?
I think she's done as well as can be expected, really. I think that, as Lee said, she had a very difficult job to start with because there were so few people to choose from and lots of people ruling themselves out from the outset. But the second problem she had was that the small number of MPs that she's got overall is that you can't shadow the entire government. I mean, if you were to shadow every single member of the government, it's more members of the government than there are Conservative MPs available to her to appoint. So I've noticed when we've seen the junior shadow ministers, the below shadow cabinet level, they're only appointed sort of one, almost two in each department. So you have a lot more. I think work going to be sort of falling on the shadow minister themselves, on the shadow cabinet minister, with the support of maybe one person. So we have seen that in the past. We've seen smaller front benches under previous leaders, sometimes deliberately. Edward Heath experimented with it at one time, having a much smaller front bench, and Michael Howard tried a smaller shadow cabinet once, which didn't quite work by his own admission. So there are different ways you can sort of play around with it. But I think in terms of how you choose the key figures, I think she has contended with the usual problem you have of trying to balance wanting to be inclusive with putting your own stamp on things, and including people who have stood against you. But it's quite a difficult thing to have to do at that point. But I think also the difficulty of sort of boxing yourself into policy quite early is something that's she's having to contend with. We've seen a few opportunities where she's been challenged on what exactly it is that she's going to do, and I think one of the first things that shadow ministers are going to have to work out is how they adapt themselves to that part of the job as they go through on the budget and other things. They will face constant questions about, well, what will you do then? You have to put down amendments to the legislation. You have to decide which ones you're going to back. One of the things that I do think the Conservative Party now has perhaps an advantage over William Hague the last time this happened, is that, and I think Lee touched on this, essentially, William Hague's problem was that the Conservative Party was sort of redundant in 1997. Tony Blair had so comprehensively accepted the Thatcherite inheritance and basically was being a sort of free market centrist, sort of right of centre party, but competent and with a sort of social conscience. That was the sort of New Labour pitch. And that made the Conservative Party redundant. There wasn't really any space for it. So a lot of the difficulty that the Conservative opposition had after 97, and all the way through really until David Cameron took over, was trying to sort of make a case for why they were needed, why they were relevant. When people were looking at New Labour and thinking, well, we've got, this is not a sort of a wild socialist government. This is a sort of, a centrist, kind of pragmatic and technocratic government that believes in free markets and a small state and lower taxes. So why do we need the Conservative Party? The advantage that the Conservative Party, I think, today has, and that Kemi Badenoch has, is that they can, from day one, make a very distinctive and credibly distinctive message to say, actually, this is a government that by its own admission has just put up taxes by £40 billion. That's not something that a Conservative would be out there sort of saying, we are proudly doing this. They can more easily differentiate themselves and make an intellectual argument for why the Conservative Party needs to exist in order to provide an alternative, in a way that I think William Hague and his successors struggled for years to make a really credible case. I mean, they tried to sort of differentiate themselves on different issues, but really the fundamentals were that they were redundant by dint of the fact that New Labour had stolen their territory. I think that Labour now is very different to New Labour, and the Conservative Party is also actually in a different place to when it was then, and they can more easily make that differentiation. So that's something I think that will be interesting. And also the big thing that you mentioned at the beginning, it is only one poll, but there are polls showing the Conservative Party sort of inching ahead. Caveats to all of that, because they've got contestants on their right as well, which is a massive problem for them, and the Labour Party's got contestants to their left. We have a multi-party system in a way that we didn't before, but you know, the fact that the Conservative Party is leading Labour in any way was, again, something that didn't happen for years and years previously. So this is a very different set of circumstances, and I think there are some opportunities there for them.
Okay, Nigel, you've actually pointed to the final question I was going to ask. One of the big differences, obviously, between some of the opposition leaders we've discussed during the webinar, i.e. William Hague, Margaret Thatcher, is that they didn't really have a meaningful competitor to their right, unless we're going to talk about the National Front, which really was completely marginal compared to Reform UK. Obviously, there is a lot of talk within the Conservative Party of trying to get those people who deserted the party for reform back, and the need to do that perhaps before turning to, you know, rather more centrist voters. I just wondered if I could give each of you a minute on whether you think, A, there is some magic bullet which would allow them to do that, and whether Kemi Badenoch is you know, ideally placed to do that. And then secondly, if you can do it in a minute, whether they should pursue that first before turning to try and get Liberal Democrat voters back, for instance, or whether actually that's something that can be done at the same time. So perhaps I'll start with you, Lee, this time.
So quite clearly, the fracturing of the right is the biggest issue facing the Conservative Party at the moment. If we continue with two parties on the right of British politics, both of whom are attracting you know, potentially up to a fifth of the vote, which is what it looks like in the poll that came out today, then that'll be a very difficult position for any party of the right to win under our political system. I think Kemi Badenoch has a good opportunity to win lots of those people over, in that I think if you want to ask, okay, what do people look for in an opposition, or what does an opposition have to do, knowing how difficult opposition can be? I think it has to look fresh. Well, I think she does look fresh from the last government. I don't think this necessarily looks like a continuity operation. I think it has to look credible. That's a question about what sort of platform she develops and how it's pitched, and we'll find out in the years to come. And I think it has to have a compelling critique, rather like Nigel was saying just now, of the government. And I think that's something which the government is helping the Conservatives develop, and I think Conservatives will develop in the years ahead. And so in that context, I think a lot of people who left the Conservatives to either go and vote for reform or to vote for the Liberal Democrats will be looking actually to see whether or not the Conservative Party can tick those boxes and can more credibly earn their vote as an alternative to a Labour government. So I don't necessarily think that comes just from doing a sort of painting by numbers exercise of saying, okay, what does the polling say that, what does the poll say that reform voters want, and how do we say it, and what does the polling say that Liberal Democrat voters want, and how do we say that as well? I think instead it's the authenticity, the coherent and credible message that's going to be key to making the Conservative Party a real force at the next election again. And I think Kemi Badenoch is quite well placed to do that.
Okay, Nigel.
Yes, I think on the face of it, she's very well placed as someone who can, I think, speak the language of a lot of reform voters, and thereby sort of get a hearing in a way that perhaps some others in the Conservative Party couldn't. But I think there is a real risk here. The thing that she needs to do is get back voters who went to the Liberal Democrats and to Labour in order to get rid of the Conservatives. And also to get back voters who went to reform. But the instinctive thing that she will face lots of siren calls for people to say, well, look, it's pretty clear what's happened here. The right has fractured. They've gone off to the right. You need to get those back. So let's go chasing after those. Well, I think the first thing to say is that a vote won back from Labour, or from someone who's voted Labour or Liberal Democrat, you know, it counts twice. Because on the one hand you're lowering their vote, but you're also taking it back from them. Chasing off after reform runs the risk that you shed even more votes from those in the centre and put more people off. So there is a risk there. But fundamentally, the fact that you have to do both, you're trying to sort of get back votes from the centre, if you like, but also from the right, means if you get that right, You get a lot of votes. If you get it wrong, then you're repelling both of them and you're losing votes on both flanks. So it is quite a risky thing to have to do. And again, it's something that previous oppositions haven't had to contend with in the same way. They were merely trying to, face the challenge of winning back votes from Labour and the Lib Dems on that side. So it's a different challenge. I would say that coming out with a convincing narrative and critique of the government and putting forward an alternative there is where you should focus your effort. And by doing that, you should be able to win back votes from the centre and also provide a reason for those who've gone off to reform to vote for you, because you're then a credible alternative government. It's not a small thing to be the second party, to be the alternative government and the official opposition for that very reason. If people want to get rid of the government, you are the repository for their votes, and that's where you need to position yourself. So I think the danger is you go running off after reform. You shouldn't. You should stand your ground and let them come to you. It would be my advice.
Okay, and final word to you, Mercy.
Yeah, so I think that it would be the wrong thing to do to lurch to the right. I do think that would actually, be a net negative for the party, because it would alienate more people than it would win over. I think it's quite simple, actually, if you want to win back reform voters, because the primary reason people voted for reform was because of the Conservatives failing on immigration after years and years consecutive manifestos of promising to get immigration down, at some point to the tens of thousands they promised. And that's absolutely not what they did. They did the opposite. And so I think if Keir Starmer and if the Labour Party don't manage to deal with the issue of immigration in a way that the British public or people who voted for reform see fit, I think it will leave a gap for the Conservatives to provide, because by then people would have really forgotten about what happened in the last Conservative government. If they can get to the next general election with Labour having not delivered on any immigration promises, and with a compelling narrative for what they will offer people in terms of the immigration question, I think that is they'll have a real chance of winning back those votes, because people will see, look, okay, we can vote for reform, but they're never going to be in government. So let's actually vote for a party that, yes, has failed us before, but memories are short, and let's give them a chance to actually deal with the immigration issues. So I think that's where really the battleground for winning back those reform voters will be.
Okay, thank you very much, Mercy. Can I just end by saying thanks to everybody for attending. Thanks for some great questions. And I want to thank our speakers, Nigel Fletcher, Lee David Evans and Mercy Muroki, for some great answers. Perhaps we should reconvene in a couple of years' time to see how Kemi Badenoch or whoever is the leader of the opposition at that point is doing. But for now, thank you very much for attending. Do have a look on our website for more events from the Mile End Institute, and we will see you here again sometime soon. Thank you very much.